Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me to come today, as well as to my co-panelists, and certainly to all of you for being here as well, because it's great to see a room full of people who are passionate about justice and access and reproductive care. So as mentioned, I'm a practicing obstetrician-gynecologist, so I can kind of share that day-to-day insight and what we see and some of the challenges we see in our practice. And my subspecialty area of interest is in contraception and family planning. I'm also the past president, actually, of the Society of Obstetricians and Gynecologists of Canada. And one of my goals was realized during my tenure there, which was the universal contraception coverage here in Canada. And I think, as Professor Sethna was saying, it's not about hope. It's about doing the homework, getting it done, doing the studies, getting the data, and then advocating, and not giving up. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit more and sort of what the impacts that would have for our practice, and a little bit more about why that might be important. And I think that, to start off, just reminding everyone that access to safe and voluntary family planning is a human right. So it's not just us saying this is a good idea. This is from the United Nations and from the World Health Organization. And the reason is that it's really a fundamental aspect of public health. And I might be preaching to the choir here, but it helps promote gender equity and women, and it reduces poverty. Having said that, interestingly, Canada is the only country in the world, with the exception of the province of BC, that up until now has a universal healthcare system, but doesn't have coverage for prescription medications, including contraceptives. And, we always look at Canada as a beacon of light to the rest of the world. But I think it's important to remember that Canada was actually cited by the UN Human Rights Commissioner in the report for the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women for having unacceptable inequities in access to contraception and abortion. So, we're not perfect, and we can do better. And when we think about it, there are 9 million women and gender diverse people of reproductive age in Canada. And if you think about it, a woman or an individual planning to have, say, 2 children during their lifetime will spend about 5 years either trying to conceive, being pregnant, or breastfeeding. And someone's reproductive age time is around 35 years, which means that they're going to spend about 30 years of their life trying to avoid an unintended pregnancy. So that's a big portion of their life. And the ability to time and space out pregnancies, as we know, has a lot of benefits for the community, socially, for family health and workforce benefits, because women can better plan their families, pursue their long-term goals, educational, work-wise. They provide more resources for their existing children, and they have lower risks, actually, for pregnancy and child development outcomes. So really, really important to have access to that. But we know that unintended pregnancies happen in Canada. We know that. You see that from the panelists that have spoken previously. I think you're all aware of that. And those have significant social ramifications. So when we talk about kind of from a gender and socio-demographic equity and health perspective, contraception is an essential medicine, which is why it was one of the things that was included when they were talking about a national framework for healthcare, universal health coverage, and prescription medications. And some people say, well, what's the big deal? Well, I would say, well, this directly impacts 50% of the population. So women's healthcare is healthcare. It's not that it's women, it's not that it's it is healthcare. It's 50% of the population, and it's nonpartisan. It shouldn't matter what political party you're part of. This is health. This is health for a very important segment of our population. And when we're talking about contraception, there are a lot of barriers to contraception. We'll talk about those, like access to providers. You were talking about getting on Ardelle's list, right? So access for providers and a lot of misinformation that's out there. But over and over, the thing that comes up is cost. And cost is always cited as a major barrier to contraception. And I think what a lot of people don't realize, and maybe Professor Sethna talked about this a little bit as well, is that not everybody has access to this. Not everybody has it paid for. In Canada, it's very patchy. It depends on where you live and where you work and what your partner does for a living, if they have insurance. And There are a lot of women, and we see this every day in our practices, that slip through the cracks. So they're just too many obstacles for them to overcome, to obtain it, their contraception. So they just kind of give up. And this results in an unintended pregnancy. And in my practice, given the practice I do, I see this every week, and we can do better on this. And some of the most effective methods, like the long-acting reversible contraceptives, which is what I often, encourage people to use in my practice, they have a high upfront cost. And if people can't pay for it, they won't use the most effective method because that's a higher upfront cost. They'll use the one that's cheaper, even though in the long term it's more expensive, but it's cheaper upfront. So kind of knowing all of those things, it was really, really exciting to be part of the federal health minister's announcement back in, I guess it was the end of February now, about the Bill C-64, which is the Act Respecting Pharmacare, knowing that contraception was going to be part of that. And even more importantly, the fact that it has now received royal assent. So when we talk about kind of looking at south of the border and what could happen, it is incredibly important. This is now enshrined in legislation. So this isn't something that someone can come in next time around and just kind of say, we're going to take this out of the budget. No, it's now enshrined in legislation. But we still have work to do. So we still have to work. That's at the federal level that it's been approved, but we now have to, knowing that it's the healthcare is provincially administered, working with the federal and the provincial governments. So your job is to advocate at the provincial level, advocate with your MPPs, because we want to continue advocating to ensure that there's some speedy agreements between the provinces and the feds. And, we talk about, maybe something you'll get back is, oh, it's going to cost too much money. Why are we doing this? And I'll argue that there's a cost of not doing this. So, the direct cost, just a direct cost of a pregnancy, unintended pregnancy in Canada is about $320 million per year. And that's not including the downstream effects. But we know that there's a significant cost savings that can be realized. So in BC, which was one of the first provinces to actually have universal coverage for contraception, they did cost modeling that showed that they would save, get cost neutrality by year 2, and by year 4, they'd be saving $27 million a year. So for every BC resident, there's a cost saving of $5, and that's money that can be reinvested in other parts of the healthcare system. So if anyone tells you we can't afford that, you say, no, we can't afford not to do it, because it actually is costing us more money to have unintended pregnancies. So, I can go on and on and on about this, but I've got 3 other speakers here. Like, this is my life's work. This is what I do. And I just want to say the other thing people talk about is that, you might hear from some people, maybe more conservatives, that birth control is about sex, and we don't want to be encouraging that. And I would argue, no, birth control is not about sex. Birth control is about having a reproductive life plan. Everybody should be allowed to have a reproductive life plan. So I think that's really, really important. This can have intergenerational impacts. It's an investment in Canada's future. And I think, as we heard just at the past panel, that I can't think of a more compelling case for this now when we look at, and having this enshrined at the federal level, when we look at how it's been kind of healthcare is being threatened and women's rights are being rolled back in other parts of the world. So, again, I just want to highlight the fact that we still have work to do on this. You are all still a part of this, because we want to make sure that women are empowered with the tools they need to control their reproductive rights. So never give up on being an advocate. Together we can make a difference. And the ability to use contraception should not depend on where you live, or your postal code, or your financial circumstances. So I'll just thank everyone for being advocates and being here, and don't give up, keep going. So we got work to do.
I'll just, lovely. Yeah, avoid the on button. That's an easier way. It's very nice to be here today. Thank you again to the organizers. It was actually quite serendipitous that all of a sudden I found myself being invited to this panel. There's more and more interest in the area of menopause, and so I've been doing more community public forums and such for education. And so it's a real privilege to be asked to be part of this amazing panel here today and share with you a bit about my clinical experience. So why menopause? Why was I invited to come here today? Well, menopause, I think, is arguably probably the biggest flashpoint now in the area of women's health. Yeah, exactly. And if we realize the importance of giving women choices when it comes to contraception, and the small piece of the pie that has been given to women's health overall, I think that menopause is really coming to the forefront because it highlights problems with both sexism and ageism. Our physician community and we, let's face it, we as women have to admit that sometimes we've been a little bit scared of this concept of age. And it's been under the rug. It's been sort of the forgotten little sister of the gynecology field. When I did my menopause training 10 years ago, I had so many people saying to me, well, you can't make a living doing menopause. What are you going to do? And so I was delivering babies and doing general gynecology and everything else. And I had a 2-month wait list. And I think it's been a perfect storm of us finally catching up with the proper interpretation of risk and benefit of hormone therapy. It's that there's a huge generation of women who've not been identified and felt their value is based on whether or not they choose or choose not to have children because they're hopefully having better access to contraception. There are many women who, or people with ovaries, who don't even have a menstrual cycle. They might have had a hysterectomy or a progestin IUD. And so again, their menstruation hasn't really played a lot into their day-to-day life at all. So for all of a sudden them to be thrown into the havoc of menopause symptoms, that takes them off of line and affects their relationships and impacts on their ability to work, they're going, what the heck? Is no one realizing that this is something that needs to be addressed? Where are the treatments? And when they hear that the treatments have been there, but have been sort of disregarded and sort of risk amplified and not even offered to them as a discussion, it's literally a flashpoint. You see that people out there are justifiably angry about this, that we haven't paid enough attention to menopause. And this is an expected physiologic phase. Again, it sort of highlights this problem that we haven't talked enough about just reproductive education and what happens. So many people don't realize when I chat with them that all the years that they were using a combined hormonal contraceptive, they weren't actually ovulating. They don't realize that the bleed that they were having in their week off was not a menstrual cycle. Like there's just so much lack of good education about people to understand about reproductive physiology. And so we should be expecting this. Everyone who has ovaries is going to go through menopause, yet the proportion of people who have access to menopause hormone therapy, whether it's because of fears, whether it's because of not having access to a provider, or that provider doesn't have the right education to give them a proper informed discussion about this. There are so many different reasons why right now the stats for the number of people using menopause hormone therapy are between maybe 4 and 10%, when 100% of people with ovaries will go through this. So it's a big problem. It also highlights real issues in our education system that as physicians, as a physician community, we've dropped the ball in educating family doctors, gynecologists, and of course, everyone in every other specialty area. When people finally make their way to me off my wait list, they've been to a cardiologist because they have palpitations. They've been to a psychiatrist because they have depression. They've been to an endocrinologist because they've had thinning hair and flashes and problems with their blood sugars and they're gaining weight. The statistics are shocking how many different healthcare providers people are referred to when this is menopause, right? So it is also a really big drain on our healthcare system for us to not be actively trying to educate people, both the public and the healthcare providers, so that we can recognize this for what it is and get to real solutions quickly rather than having people suffering and just being passed around like a hot potato in the healthcare system. So where do we need areas of research? We need always more research about hormone therapy, the different types of hormone therapy. There are a lot of generalizations made about does this one give you more risk versus that? There are very few head-to-head studies between different types of hormone therapies. There are lots of generalizations that are made and sort of gray areas that are just sort of filled in with sort of best guesses. So we always need more research on actual different types of hormone therapy, but also different uses of it and long-term use. Because again, as we are now living longer, the question of, well, how long can you be on your hormone therapy? This 5-year rule or this 10-year rule that a lot of people have felt is where things get dangerous, that's being questioned. And that really isn't even based on research. That was just based on fear and saying, well, at some point, it probably isn't good for you anymore. We better stop it. That isn't based on research. And we need more research on costs. So costs to the workplace of lost productivity, cost to relationships and the impact in our homes, the cost of not having access. So again, there are places like BC and Ireland that are starting to talk about making menopausal hormone therapy freely available. Well, are they really going to leave that option of what that therapy will be up to the physician and the person? Or is it going to be this one formulation and this is covered and that's it? So we need research on that. We need research among people's experiences. So different cultures will experience menopause differently, different age groups. So whether or not you go through menopause early, whether or not you have it surgically because of endometriosis or something that removed your ovaries. If you have a different sexual identity, if we think that menopause has been undervalued in this, just the heteronormative population, it is extremely difficult for people who have a different sexual identity. And we need to have more research about just aging well. So again, there's a lot of disinformation now out there where now everyone should go on to hormone therapy. Otherwise you will get dementia and heart disease and your bones are going to crumble. That's not based on research either. So where the pendulum continues to swing back and forth, and now we almost have these camps of people who are bartering and arguing between them. And it's because a lot of it is lack of research and global education. So that's something that we really need to address. And we really need to talk more about like living well, aging well, being healthy, preventative health. Menopause hormone therapy is excellent for a lot of different symptoms, and it can definitely be something where we are advising when people are at high risk, for example, osteoporosis. But there's also a lot when it comes to coaching people about less alcohol, about more exercise. As we get older, we need to be exercising more and actually intentionally strength training to hold on to muscle. These things make a huge impact to how we age as well. So we can't either, get into this trope of saying, well, give everyone menopausal hormone therapy and then that will fix all your aging problems. It's a drop in the bucket compared to all these other things that will impact us as we get older. So I'm glad that menopause is now at the forefront in order for me to even have an invitation like this to come and speak with you all, because this is something that we are all talking about. We're all having conversations, advocacy, doesn't matter what your gender is or what your age is. This is a really pertinent topic for us to be now discussing. And I'm looking forward to chatting about it with the panel in a few minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. It's very exciting to hear from everybody. Well, thank you for inviting me to speak and share. I come here from Boston, but I bring with me my work and my experience in Lebanon as a nurse and a researcher, and some consultations in the Middle East, and to talk about where healthcare intersects with systemic barriers. I was sitting here very proudly listening to how everybody was talking about colonialism, and I'm like, oh my God, that is exactly where a lot of what I'm going to talk about is rooted in. So my work has focused a lot on, I lead the Lebanese Medical Association for Sexual Health, and that is the cover that we use for LGBT health, but we also do women's health because in that region, same sexual relationships are labeled as not normal and criminalized, and I will talk a little bit about that in a minute. But, I'll provide a little spotlight on some of the challenges that are facing the healthcare systems there and how that would affect, the globalized world and how where people migrate and move around, and how a lot of us here in this room could have an impact on people living in the region as well. And I'll also touch on some policies that would really, give a thought process on how are the realities in war-torn and crisis-affected regions. Because, talking about the Middle East, it is a place where it had been a cradle of many of the world's oldest societies and civilizations, but also since very long ancient times, whether it's from ancient Egypt times to the Phoenician era, there were a lot of conversations about advancements of healthcare and human rights, but that all ended with, the Ottoman Empire and then the end of World War I, and then the European colonial mandates that kept going on and on and on and taking different forms, but it's still colonialism, but having different names across the years. And so, Lebanon, where I grew up in and worked, became a French mandate in 1920, but got independence in 1943. But all the regulations and laws until 2024 have been relics of the French mandate back in the 1920s. So think about the healthcare system in the 1920s in France and how that has really dictated and impacted what we deal with now. But also, why hasn't that changed? It's because if you look at the history since the 40s until now, not only like world wars have ended, but yet the region has been under one crisis after the other until even today. We are facing genocide. We've faced several political and economic crises in the last 10 years. So all this really gives us that social determinants of health lens to try to see how our human rights and healthcare practices kind of governed in the area. So also to think about, like, if we want to pass regulations or if we want to advance human rights, like how are we going to do that? Lebanon's government is based, and that's a French colonial relic, on a confessional system where, we have 18 recognized, and I focus on recognized, religious sects, and they need to be represented in the government. And, if we know anything about religion, nobody gets along. And so we have sometimes pockets of time where we have no government and no regulations. But these religious sects are mainly focused in Islam and Christianity. And there's 18 of them. So there has been widespread struggles. And how does that help affect healthcare? Healthcare in Lebanon has this dual system where we have the private and the public sectors or providers. Most people have some form of both. Everybody is eligible for the public sector. However, with lack of government and lack of ruling and lack of policies and lack of funding and corruption and all the things that happen in the region, the public healthcare sector is crumbling and really sometimes does not have the resources. Although there are some of the good foundations of things, like there are a lot of the chronic healthcare medications and treatments that on paper would be covered by the public healthcare sector if they have money, which a lot of times they don't. Then comes the private healthcare sector, which, like any private healthcare sector, is very privileged to those who can have access to healthcare. But what does privilege mean in a place like Lebanon or the Middle East? It's not only financial privilege, there's a social level of privilege where people with different identities, whether it's sexual minorities, with different gender identities, unmarried women, and others who do not conform to that heteronormative lens, may or may not be able to, most likely may not be able to access full healthcare coverage, including access to contraception, even access to a regular gyno exam. If you're not married, you're not getting that because nobody wants to document that you might have been sexually active on their medical charts. Rather, don't think about all the other things that could come with that. But also thinking about disclosing sexual identities within the healthcare practice and how that would affect. So why is that important to think about all these? Because, other than thinking about, abortion is illegal, yet it happens, and there are a lot of issues that go with that. LGBT health is criminalized and not an absent almost, and it is reliant on NGOs that are supported and funded by international agencies and organizations. And so what we recognize is that penal code of criminalization is used to threaten people within their livelihood, within everywhere they function, including the healthcare system. But also, it is not used on everybody. It is used based on trying to create harm, because there are some rulings that stop people from using it, but also the weakest link is actually the person who is taken to a police station and given a test to test their sexuality. And I'm going to say, like, one of the tests they do is trying to insert a hard object, and most of the times they use an egg through the anal cavity to try to see I don't know how that tests if somebody's sexuality, but that's one of the ways to test somebody's sexuality. Or if a woman is caught in what they would say indecent space, they would go test their virginity. And if that woman is not legally married and was not present with their legally married person she's married to, then also that would create, like, these people would go to jail for an undisclosed amount of time, because when people enter the jail, it's not easy to get out. And so all these issues are things that we think about and dictate our healthcare system. And it really has that influence in culture, in religion. And so it kind of has that religious conversation of thinking about traditional values, interpretations of religious texts, and creating that conversation that sometimes ends nowhere. And so now with all this displacement and all the refugee status and a war-torn country where human rights always takes second place in terms of safety, we have a lot of healthcare issues and a lot of NGOs and international organizations who are going around trying to protect people's safety, whether it is just to be themselves, or it is also protecting women's health, trying to provide sanitation products, trying to provide contraception, trying to provide safe and clean spaces for giving birth, but also trying to protect all the LGBTQ population from being prosecuted, because that is the number one thing that happens when there is chaos, where people are just prosecuted because they shouldn't exist and trying to eliminate existence. And then trying to say, well, looking up, and I know, like, I come from the US and I haven't heard the US mention Trump like you all did here today, but also in Lebanon, we do the same thing where we mention the US, and anytime Westernized countries are not LGBTQ plus or women's health friendly, we say, well, this is a Western idea and the West is not supportive. And there are all these religious leaders who kind of try to reference all these regulations that are either religious or Western born. So we all have a responsibility to try to say, how can we promote health and well-being, not only where we live, but elsewhere too. Thank you.
Hello. So thank you so much for agreeing to include me in this panel. I was quite thrilled. So we're going to shift gears significantly, I'm going to say, because my perspective is quite different, being that ethicists see the more unusual, very confusing, very gray area situations. And really our role is to help providers process and navigate some of their ethical obligations. So we're thinking about things like consent and capacity. We're thinking about substitute decision-making. We're thinking about moral distress, which shockingly nobody has mentioned today. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. Withholding, withdrawing treatment, patients who are living at risk, complex discharges, the list goes on. But this far, we've been thinking and talking quite high level, but I think it's really important to consider who we're excluding or marginalizing in the process of regulating and litigating, because I know there's a lot of lawyers here. So these are not straightforward decisions, but ones that require balancing ethical principles with the practical reality faced by patients, by families, and by providers. So I think the best way to get out of that really high level thinking is to talk about some cases. So I'm going to give you two cases, and these are real situations, anonymized and relevant facts changed. So don't worry about that, that we've encountered, because I think that it's useful, like I said, to ground some of those concerns that we see and to help provide a little bit of context. So for a minute or two here, if you're a lawyer, take off your lawyer hat, take off your student hat, whatever hat it is you usually wear, except for maybe Nicolia can keep her hat on because she's also an ethicist. But for the next minute or two, you are going to be a nurse or a nurse practitioner in a rural-ish community in Ontario. And what I would like for you to ideally think about as we're talking about these is what you don't know. So this is somewhat intentionally vague, not just for privacy purposes, but because this is how these things come up, right? So think about all the things we don't know as we go through this. So the first case, a 21-year-old woman with cerebral palsy and OCD. Over the last several weeks, the patient has come to her community health clinic multiple times a week to request pregnancy tests and to express an interest in getting pregnant or having a baby. The patient's mom, who's also her POA, so her power of attorney, wants the patient to be on contraceptives to prevent pregnancy. The patient can't receive hormonal injections due to other medications that she takes, and there are additional concerns with compliance around taking oral contraceptives. So the mom has gone ahead and made an appointment for an IUD insertion, to which she obviously has consented, but the patient doesn't know about this. And so there are a few concerns here, right? The first being her safety, because she's told the staff that she engages in risky sexual and social behaviors. B, there's a concern on behalf of the substitute decision maker because she wants to prevent pregnancy. The patient likely does not understand the risks involved and the consequences associated with things like pregnancy, birth, childcare, STIs, STDs, et cetera. And C, from the provider perspective, we're thinking about what am I supposed to do if I've been asked to insert an IUD and I have a patient in front of me who's strenuously objecting? So that's the first case. Second case, a similarly situated young man, so a young man in his early 20s with cerebral palsy, who's nonverbal and experiences some cognitive challenges in hemiplegia. So he's recently started to engage in constant self-stimulatory behavior following a delayed puberty. This behavior has become a source of significant distress for his caregivers who have tried various interventions without success, such as behavioral strategies and clothing modifications. His parents, who are his substitute decision makers, have raised the possibility of using testosterone suppression to manage. While this approach, often likened to chemical castration, might decrease the frequency of these behaviors, the team is considering its medical implications, including impacts on his bone health, his muscle development, his metabolism, and his overall mood. So there have been previous attempts with other types of antipsychotic medications, SSRIs, et cetera, that have not been effective. So we've tried some other things. And there are concerns about the long-term effects and the reversibility of something like testosterone suppression. So you can put your other hats back on now if you want to, but there are a few key things sort of from an ethics perspective that we would be thinking about as relevant as we're navigating these types of decisions. So first and foremost is this idea of risk, like what truly constitutes risk. So there's this perception that, in these cases, we have two young people who are engaging in what's actually probably pretty developmentally appropriate behaviors, yet their actions are perceived as risky by others, which influences how their care is sought and provided. And the second piece is from that is then who are we protecting, from what, and why? So think about what exactly, what risk does an IUD help address in that situation? One, that's a really narrow sort of piece of risk to be thinking about. The second thing is this idea of consent, and beyond the idea of just a substitute decision maker providing consent. When we're talking about consent and capacity, which we did have a bit of an introduction to earlier in the day, we want to know whether or not someone can understand, appreciate, and articulate the consequences of their decision or their indecision. So the other thing to keep in mind, as was pointed out so eloquently earlier, is that these are time and decision and treatment specific. So capacity is something that's really challenging to evaluate on an ongoing basis. And with individuals like this, one thing that happens a lot is we say, well, they're incapable point blank period, because historically that's how they've been treated in the healthcare system, is that they're not capable to make any sort of decisions. So while consent is that authorization provided by a substitute decision maker, often a parent, a spouse, a family member, there's this other piece that we're looking for, which is assent. So an incapable person's agreement or willingness to participate in whatever it is that's going on that acknowledges their presence and their personhood in any given moment. So to place an IUD or some other similarly invasive procedure that's not life-threatening, the patient's assent would still typically be sought. And for that to be meaningful, it does need to be voluntary. To provide something like hormone injection therapy, you can see how quickly some of that calculus changes, because the threshold for assent is going to be significantly lower because it's not as invasive and it might address a behavior. So depending on how we phrase that, we could say it's treatment. So then the third piece is this idea of contraception versus treatment. So contraception, gender-affirming care, reproductive care can sometimes be considered treatment if it provides a therapeutic or clinical benefit. And in the first case, contraception serves to prevent pregnancy rather than to treat a medical condition. So its primary purpose is not necessarily therapeutic. So what I'm trying to convey by sharing these cases with you is that when we discuss consent and the elements of capacity required to make these decisions about reproductive care, it's important to consider who might be excluded from the process. And I don't just mean patients. Keep in mind that these are often community-based providers who are not and should not be expected to be legal experts. They work in small teams, serving vulnerable populations who rely on them for critical care and decisions. And when faced with these uncertainties, providers often experience moral distress. So they're confronted with a very difficult choice, either to acquiesce to the request of a substitute decision maker who's provided that consent and may reasonably be acting in the person's best interest, or they refuse that request because it goes against the fundamental ethos of medicine to do no harm. And yet, refusing that request might also result in some harm, and we can think about what those might be. But the providers are acutely aware of the psychosocial concerns surrounding their patients, and these concerns are also very legitimate. So this leaves providers feeling trapped, believing that no matter what they choose, someone will be disappointed, and they may question whether or not their decision was truly right in the end. These are deeply challenging situations, more common than we may realize, and these issues are rooted in the ambiguity of legal frameworks, rooted in historical injustices against vulnerable groups, resource constraints, and the significant burdens faced by caregivers, social services, healthcare professionals, and the list goes on. So above all, the goal, in my view, as we're trying to think about regulating in a way that prioritizes the true best interests of each individual, while addressing the legitimate concerns of those who care for and support them.
I'm just going to follow up on that because I think one of the things that we find the moral distress by situations like that for healthcare providers is huge. And one of the challenges we sometimes face is pressure from other healthcare providers to do something that we're not comfortable with in cases like that. I'm thinking of instances like, I think there's a talk about permanent sterilization procedures earlier, so permanent contraception procedures, and having other healthcare providers try to exert pressure that this needs to be done because it's medically not safe for them to get pregnant, but the patient doesn't want to do that, right? So you talk to them about their alternatives. Similarly, I've had referrals where it's like, now's the perfect window of opportunity. They haven't been, they have a psychiatric history. They've never been open to the idea of permanent contraception before, but now they are. So can you get them in and get it done? And to me, that's, it's like you said, it's time and time dependent. So I don't know that that's really something that would be considered consent and sometimes it's it's their right to have this, but at the same time you think, yeah, but I don't know that they understand the implications. So yes, it's their right to have an abortion. I have no argument with that, but I don't think you understand what this entails as a healthcare provider. So you need to let us explain that. So moral distress, like I've felt it. So just, and it's a real thing that we deal with. And I'm sure you deal it with, with the group that you're caring for, and and Ardelle, I know, has dealt with it as well. So thanks for bringing that up. It's a challenge. Like who you. So how do we know? How do we know who we're working for at that point, or who we're trying to serve at that point?
Good question. But I do think moral distress is sort of like the monster under the bed. Like everyone's experiencing it, and no one wants to sort of name and shame it a little bit or talk about it. But a lot of the research on moral distress shows that is like the best antidote to moral distress is to just talk about it and to have open and frank conversations about like, this feels really wrong, or something. Like as you listen to those cases, I'm sure everyone as a human being has some sort of intuition that like something doesn't feel right. And like, that's all it is to just say something doesn't feel right. Because a lot of times it's not. And I think you bring up a good point. Like there are a lot of providers who I talk to who end up in a situation where they're like, I don't think this is the right decision, but I would rather, like, it's a bit of a harm reduction argument. Like if something bad is going to happen, I would rather be a person who feels I can prevent some of those harms than to let this person just be bounced around because I know someone else will provide this thing, and that might be even worse. So yeah, it's a huge challenge.
I was just thinking about what you were describing in Lebanon, just this concept of women not having access to gynecologic care if they're not married, because nobody wants to document what problems they might be having, and this concept of still using that archaic notion that a gynecologic exam can tell you if you're a virgin, and these concepts of virginity. And there was just so much about what you described that just was blowing my mind as you were describing it. So I hope we have a chance to talk more about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a shame, but all these are, the healthcare record is a public record, not public, but like it's a legal record. So, and it could be used to shame, and it could be used to provide legal bounds to prosecute people. And no healthcare provider, again, it goes to the moral distress, wants to be part of that loop. But at the same time, nobody wants to be the person who identifies either an STI or, you know, an unwanted pregnancy. And so that goes to what happens is that nothing happens. And then the worst ends up being like a socially medicated approach to how to deal with women's health.
I think that's I mean, it's a good point too, because as a provider, and I'm not sure how it is in Lebanon, but as a provider, if that provider is now at risk themselves of being targeted or being, you know, put in jail or something. And again, we think that, oh, that can't happen in North America. And unfortunately, it can. And even when last year when Roe versus Wade, when that was struck down, and the effect and the ripple effect we're seeing here. And we had to meet with our medical protection agency to try to determine how we would be covered and what would be the effect on us if someone from the United States came to Canada to have an abortion performed, and would the CMPA protect us? How would that affect us? Would it mean we would be on a no-fly list, or we couldn't get into the United States at that point? And we laugh, but actually that was one of the things that was being threatened. So, you know, just that implications, again, it creates that moral distress. How does it affect the provider? Because it's hard to provide that service. And, you know, thankful to all the women or the healthcare providers in the past who provided services even when things weren't illegal, so that people could have access. But just ensuring that we still advocate to have that safe access to care. And how do we set an example as a country so that when Lebanon looks and they look to the West, they say, well, in Canada, they don't say that. So they say, this is okay. So it's okay. So how do we kind of counteract that effect?
I mean, on the short term, a lot of us healthcare professionals have gone the NGO route, where, you know, we provide practices through NGOs that are not part of healthcare or medical institutions that are at risk for being sued, or people losing their licenses. And so that way it is part of community service, and it kind of falls between the cracks of laws and regulations. But this is a bandage effect until there is a way where, you know, policies could be changed.
Thank you so much for each of the talks. I had a question about menopause. So I think, but not like that. So I am all for educating people about like all the many, many symptoms that occur with menopause. The one that I am sort of worried about, and I'm interested in hearing you kind of talk about how we should talk about it, is the effects on people's work performance. And I'm thinking about gender discrimination in the workplace. So women are less likely to get hired. They're more likely to be paid less than men, and then they're less likely to be promoted, right? These are just well established. And if you intersect that with age discrimination in the workplace, and we're saying, oh, well, women of menopausal age are just not going to be as good at their jobs, or they're going to be distracted, or they're not getting enough sleep or whatever. So I'm just, you know, I think it's important to make people aware that that can be associated with menopause, but I'm also worried about the kind of the implications for kind of further contributing to gender discrimination. Thanks.
And this is being discussed a lot now, right? Is this concept of there are people who obviously strongly advocate that we need to have more empathy and we need to have more flexible workplaces in order to accommodate for these things. But then other people are saying, well, then that's going to make people a target, like you said. As a little side note, my mom, who was maybe 60 some, when she moved from one province to the other, she'd been a nurse, and she decided to apply for a job at a pharmacy. And she realized that with her age, she might not look like someone who they'd want to hire. And when she had an interview with the pharmacist, she said, look, I'm menopausal, so I am not going to be drunk and not able to come to work the next day. I'm not going to need a mat leave. And she like listed a bunch of things that were really interesting advantages of being menopausal, and made her an ideal and reliable employee. She got the job. So, you know, it's one of these things of perspective too, right? And I think when people have been feeling like they are marginalized for their symptoms and who have truly suffered, they are the people who are more concerned about it really impacting on people. Where the crux of menopause is that the experience is so broad that there are people who have sailed through it. There are people who, if they have accessed care and therapies, their symptoms are managed and they can carry on. And that ends up being one of the biggest reasons why, just like with contraception, we have to make it accessible to people to get to providers that can give them therapies to treat the symptoms so that they can carry on with their lives, with their jobs, with their relationships, with their healthy lifestyles and their physical activities and such. So I think we're in this awkward in between stage right now where we're trying to talk about all the multiple impacts that it can have, but we don't either want that to make us a target. And I think it's just going to take us time to work through that. Yeah.
You know, it's funny because we spend all of this time preparing people for puberty, right? You talk to them about puberty. These are the changes that are going to happen. Your breasts are going to get hair, and we talk about that, but we don't talk about what's happening at the other end. So what we see is people come in and they literally think they're going crazy, right? They think they're going crazy. They think their husband's going to leave them because they're biting their head off all the time. Like their kids are like, why are you yelling at me all the time? They're not performing at work. So I think maybe it's, they do talk about creating these menopause friendly workplaces, but completely understand the point, right? Like, I feel the same way, right? Does that mean that people are going to think I can't do my job if I'm menopausal or perimenopausal? So I think it's partly about preparing a little bit better for that, making sure people are educated and that they know there are options out there. Because I think there's this thought, like from, my mom's generation was certainly like, it's just something that happened and you just dealt with it, right? And I don't think we're at that point now. I think we're at a point where we have options that can help improve people's quality of life so that they don't get palpitations all the time. They can maybe sleep at night and they can concentrate at work a little bit better. And that actually allows them to be the best that they can be at that work, knowing that, at their job or whatever it is they're doing. So to me, it's all about that education and preparing people for that stage of life, the same way we prepare people for what's going to happen when they go through puberty. It's like this kind of forgotten part. And when you think about, how much time does someone spend when looking at the average age, life expectancy now, you're spending 25, 30 years potentially in the menopause. That's a long time. And you want to feel good during that time if you can. So I'm thankful for people to Ardelle who's really advocating for this and giving menopause its moment and showing that, the importance of kind of addressing these issues.
Thank you, everyone. My name is Joachim Mark Tamale, and I am an LLM candidate at the University of Ottawa. I'm very grateful to the organizers. I always say this every time. The Center of Law here is the best in North America. Yeah, so I'm here to do some little positive politicking. Every time I come to speak, I always emphasize that women's health rights are not just rights, are not a concern of only women. They are a concern of everyone because it doesn't affect 50%, as you said, one of you said, it actually affects everyone. So I always come here to emphasize, and every time I enter the room, I always look around. What's the composition of the room? Does it really cover that? Is it really weighing a lot? Because the attendees here really show how important it is to them. So I'm very grateful to the organizers about that. And then secondly, I'm doing my research about health rights of immigrants and refugees. So you brought in an insight to affordability, accessibility, informed consent, and things like that. So at the back, I was having lots of questions about the things I see because I've worked with immigrants and refugees. So the things I see, is it because they do not have access to contraceptives or things like that? Yeah. So thank you so much for opening my eyes more in my area of research, and I'm very grateful to the center. Thank you so much.
Well, I could start by saying, immigrants bring a lot of their own cultural and healthcare norms with them wherever they go. So their perception of the healthcare system starts with their perception of the healthcare system they were used to for where they, lived the majority of their life. And then they come also into a healthcare system with the beliefs of what they've heard about the healthcare system that they are entering in the country that they are in. And so that is very complex and complicated because not everything they've heard is actually accurate. But at the same time, they come with all the complexities of immigration and being refugees and what they can and cannot do at different times of their stay. And then comes all those culturally appropriate and respectful healthcare system that embraces them and makes them feel they belong. And so all that creates an access issue. It's not only in relation to cost, that is another whole bigger conversation, but it also creates an access issue of feeling like any immigrant who, I was an immigrant myself, and I would walk in and I say, oh, they're not going to understand how I'm going to say things and what they're going to tell me. And so whatever I'm told, I am not receiving. And so, and I see that also with a lot of immigrants and refugees and people who are really entering a new society that says things differently, calls things differently, approaches things differently. And so as healthcare people, we need to really have some more cultural humility and understanding and not think of access only as cost and availability of the actual treatment, but also, being able to have a conversation that is like a two-way conversation.
I'm going to exercise moderator's prerogative and ask a question. Just this morning, I was lecturing at University of Ottawa's medical school in their second year program about abortion and physician obligations with respect to counseling around abortion. And I made this passionate plea about how law and medicine have to work together. I can open the doors, you have to walk through them, all that stuff. So now you're sitting here in front of a room full of lawyers. There's a lot of lawyers here. So it's your opportunity to make your plea about what political and legal advocacy you really would love us to take on to some to help the interest that you're trying to do as practitioners.
Is this like our Christmas list? Yeah, it is. Is our wish list for Santa?
Yeah.
Cool.
Who wants to start?
I'll start.
I think I said a little bit of it, right? And like we work closely with lawyers oftentimes because there are some things that are within the scope of an ethicist to provide advice on, and there are some things that are not, and they're linked. And I think one of the things is really like those case studies are really intended to put you in the shoes of a provider, of a patient, of a caregiver, and to just think through all those different perspectives and whether or not you agree with someone. Try to appreciate where they're coming from and the concerns that they have, and to validate and legitimize those. That goes a long way in reducing some of that moral distress like we talked about. So yeah, I think that's probably the biggest thing. I think law and medicine exist at like sort of a stratosphere sometimes, and we forget that like what it's like to be in a frontline position, or what it's like to be a patient. We've all been a patient or will be a patient at some point in our lives. So think about the fact that these systems are eventually you're going to want them to be set up in a way that also benefits you and people that you interact with on a daily basis. So I think that would be my hope.
What I also can say is that we need to be working together because, you said like together we can do things. And I see a lot of policies and regulations passed with consultations with healthcare professionals, but the healthcare professionals are not at the table all the time. And so, as these regulations are put together, they take a legal angle and miss some of the healthcare related expertise that could have intertwined. And we see healthcare related decisions being done without representation from the actual population it will affect, but also from professionals who deal with the patient population day to day. I see a lot of consultations. I'm not saying lawyers and lawmakers don't ask healthcare professionals, but they need to be there through the whole conversation and through the drafting of things, because sometimes the idea is there, but the way it's said, the implementation process is really not something that is applicable.
Yeah, and even just thinking about that as we looked at the pharmacare and having contraception included as that and the advocacy required for that and the explanations of why certain things had to be there, why all things had to be there. So that's definitely important to have all the stakeholders at the table because I think that that'll end up being better for everyone. And then, I mean, clearly, I think as lawyers, we have our work cut out for us in maintaining what we do have with respect to reproductive rights in Canada and trying to kind of improve areas where we may not be as good as we could be and try to avoid going backwards. I think that's my biggest plea is don't give up from that perspective and continue to work with providers who are identifying these challenges and to keep pushing back against people who are otherwise trying to roll things back because we've made so much progress and we should be going forward.